Hi everybody, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Thursday, February 4th, where we are continuing to talk about a sorrowful woman, as well as talking about the story of an hour and the reading and the writing process. So where we left off last class is I was talking a little bit about some of the techniques for reading very well. And we had discussed that you should begin at the very beginning of a text. So we can see that Gail Godwin is the author. We can see that this piece was published in 1971, right at the time of the women's rights movement. The A in the title, A Sorrowful Woman, rather than the in a Sorrowful Woman, would be suggestive that this is one of many. And then the Once Upon a Time, there was a wife and mother, one too many times, which is where our attendance question was, where I asked you to speculate as to why that opening sentence is so important. Definitely it helps to establish the mood and tone of the story. Once Upon a Time is supposed to evoke images of fairy tales. Fairy tales are supposed to end positively, which is what we saw in A Secret Sorrow with Faye and Kai. But this story is going to be very different. And we're told that there was a wife and mother one too many times. And the role of wife and mother is one of the major pieces of this particular story. Note that none of the characters are given first names, which helps to universalize their experience beyond just this particular family unit's experience to other families' experiences. And Gail Godwin is writing this from the perspective of the female character, the sorrowful woman, so to speak. And we begin with a winter evening, and that already is a clue. Winter is supposed to represent descent and death. Evening does the same, so oftentimes you can use the times of the day to represent stages of life. So morning would be youth, and then afternoon would be the height of life or adulthood, and then afternoon would be the beginning of descent, or evening would be the beginning of descent, and then nighttime ultimately would be death. And it's the same thing with the seasons, where spring would represent new beginnings or youth, summer, the height of life, and then we've got fall, the beginning of descent, and then finally what we've got is winter, and that's supposed to represent descent. So Gail Godwin, with a PhD in English, is very clearly using literary techniques in order to be able to put forth her agenda or her message. And what we need to do is to read the story, try to figure out what her agenda and message is, and then we can decide whether or not we agree or disagree with it. And of course, when we read at the very beginning, the husband was durable, receptive, and gentle. And those are an odd choice of words to refer to someone's spouse as durable. The child is a tender golden 3, which is supposed to represent perfection, unless you've spent any time with a toddler, and then you know that a 3-year-old doesn't necessarily represent perfection. The sight of them made her so sad and sick, she did not want to ever see them again. So, of course, the major question is, why is she so sorrowful? And that has to do with her role as a wife and mother. And as we get more information about the story, we see that she seemingly has the ideal life. She has a caring and loving husband. She has a caring and loving son. They live a life of comfort. They're obviously financially secure because they can afford things like live-in help, having their laundry done, going out to dinners. There isn't any kind of mention of any medical conditions or other difficulties within the family. So in many ways, it would seem to be perfection. But what happens when perfection is not enough? And what happens when perfection is not perfection from your perspective? Remember, all Faye wanted was a family. And once she got that, she lived happily ever after. This is the story of a woman who has that family. And we find out what happens with the ever after. And it's not necessarily happily for this particular woman. And if we think about the 1970s and some of the ways that women's roles were being challenged, the traditional role of housewife Even think about the term housewife as if someone is actually married to the house. And mother, what happens when those roles aren't satisfying for you and you want something else? And in the 1970s and the 1960s, there are many fewer options than there are today in terms of wanting something else. So, as we continue to read this particular piece, we find that the husband continually says he understands, but I would suggest he really doesn't understand. He certainly wants to help, and he tries to the best of his ability, but all he does is he makes things worse in some respects because he's enabling her behavior. And I don't know if she even is aware of why it is she is so sorrowful. She probably cannot articulate the feelings that she has, but certainly her actions would seem to indicate some of the reasons why she is acting the way she does. We're told that the child's eyes and the husband's shirt were gray. And again, that's a color that oftentimes is associated with darkness and depression and negativity. So again, the author is using very specific details with things like the time of day and things like color imagery to reinforce the message or the theme. And notice how already this story is so much more complex than A Sorrowful Woman. And that was the whole point behind this, outside of our reading this particular piece, was to see how this was really a piece of literature that was worth academic study, as opposed to something that's much more formulaic and predictable. Certainly this story is not at all predictable. And we get the episode where the husband is removing her bra and helping her to undress. And again, he's trying his best to be supportive of her. The bra is an interesting piece of clothing because it's supposed to offer support, but it also is restrictive. And one could say that the author is using that as a symbol for some of the restriction that the woman feels. And the bra is removed, but only partially. Perhaps suggestive of the idea that the restrictions she has are only able to be partially removed. And the bra is oftentimes an article of clothing that's associated with sexuality and eroticism. And that's hardly the case in this scene. With Faye and Kai, we could have been introduced to a love scene here, but that wasn't the case at all with the woman and the husband. And what she wants is instant sleep. There's a little bit of foreshadowing there because that's exactly what's going to happen by the ending. And the husband, in trying to assist her, is providing her with these sleeping potions, these sleeping drafts. And we get fine detail later on that he begins making them in batches. In other words, we are being given the means with which she is able to commit suicide by the ending, though we don't know that through our initial read-through, because we don't know that she is going to die at the ending. So when we reread this piece, already knowing the plot, then we can really appreciate many of the details embedded within it. The child pretends to be a vicious tiger, and that's an interesting choice from the author as well. A tiger is seen as a predator, and that's how the woman perhaps views the child, that the child is basically taking away her life force or is in one way or another a threat to her. The child scratches her wrist, and they watch the blood basically pearl off of her wrist, and that too is perhaps some foreshadowing of a common way of suicide, though that's not necessarily the way that she's going to commit suicide. But again, the author is trying to create a certain tone. And then the idea of how the wife is so, and mother is so frightened by the grasshopper. Grasshopper is a live being, and notice that this grasshopper has been caught and taken into the house, and in some ways has been confined and restricted in the same way that perhaps the woman feels confined and restricted in the house. Notice that this entire story, for at least the woman's perspective, outside of the very few times where she's able to leave the house for something like a dinner, the house is in many ways a place of confinement, not necessarily a place of security. And when she hits the child, and she does it when she knows that the husband will see, one would say that that's probably a cry for help. Again, she may not necessarily be able to articulate what kind of help she needs, but obviously she knows that she is unsatisfied and unhappy. The husband, in trying to help, finds the perfect girl who happens to not be pretty. And that's important because we don't want this girl to serve as a kind of sexual threat, Again, if this was a piece of formulaic fiction, what would end up happening is they would hire a very attractive girl, and then the husband and the girl would ultimately have some sort of an affair. But this is not a formulaic piece. So the girl is not supposed to be a threat because she's not physically attractive. However, the girl ends up being an incredible threat to the mother because the girl can complete all of the tasks and happily do so in a way that the mother cannot. And it's not that the mother is unable to do these tasks, because as we see at the very ending of the story, she does them all and more so when we have that kind of laundry list of all of the things that she does in the household before she commits suicide. But she doesn't take pleasure or satisfaction from it because she feels as if she wants more. Now, of course, the girl is in a very different position than the woman. The girl is hired. She's paid for her services. She has the ability to make the choice to take that job or leave, as opposed to the woman. Now, you might say the woman made the choice ultimately to get married. Though, when you think about the cultural and societal expectations of the time, one would be considered rather odd not to marry. So one could say that she was basically just trying to fulfill societal expectations and realize that once she did, that for whatever reason, that wasn't satisfying to her. So there's two ways that we can view this mother. We can see her as incredibly selfish because she has so much in her life, yet she wants more. Or we can empathize with this woman, understanding that all of us want more than what we currently have. It's probably the reason why you are listening to this video right now and why you are in college, because regardless of your life situation, you want to better it. And we encourage that as a society to better ourselves. But this woman is unable to break free from the societal expectations of the time. Now, of course, it isn't just the expectations of being a wife, it's also being a mother. So it's one thing to say that one feels trapped by their marriage, but obviously this woman has responsibilities to her child, and those responsibilities are responsibilities that she neglects. So from that perspective, we certainly as readers can view the mother negatively. However, the author and the way the author presents this story wants us to view this character positively. And we get this through her perspective and her story, because this could easily be a sorrowful man. And this would be the husband's story, which would be equally fascinating to hear. And we could get the sorrowful child, and that would be even perhaps more fascinating to hear the child's perspective about this. But it's a sorrowful woman. And what does it mean to be a woman when you don't even have an individual identity so that you have a name? Instead, you're viewed as a wife and that you're viewed as a mother. Well, they hired that girl who goes into a room, paints it white, and there are lots of color associations with white, both positive and negative. Some of the positives are associated with things like brightness and a new start and hope and opportunity. Some of the negatives is that white can be seen as rather bland or dull or institutional. And then on one winter afternoon, the mother goes and begins wearing an old sweater from school. The assumption is that the mother is trying to relive her past, a past when she didn't have the responsibilities of being a wife or a mother, where she cared for herself rather than caring for other people. And what we see is that the woman ends up firing the girl because she feels so unhappy and so threatened by all of the capabilities the girl has. And the husband basically takes on all of the roles of wife and mother, again, trying to be supportive. And in the 1970s, that would have been seen as somewhat unusual. Again, in our current time period, it's more unusual not to have dual roles. I'm sure many of you are both caretakers of your home as well as caretakers of your family. So you may not necessarily be terribly impressed with the actions of the husband. But in the 1970s, it was a completely different world. So we can see how he is sacrificing himself and trying to assist the woman, but not offering her the assistance that she needs. And perhaps he's unable to offer her the assistance that she needs. Mental health issues were something that were not discussed publicly and in the way they are today. And even today, they are somewhat taboo. But it would be too simplistic to read the story and say that she just has a mental health issue. She has a mental health issue because of the societal restraints that have been put upon her in being a wife and a mother. That's really the point the author is trying to make. Now, you can, of course, disagree with the author. You can say, well, she could have just gotten divorced. Again, the 1970s being a different time period, it may not necessarily have been an option. Certainly, it would have been much more socially taboo than it would be today to do something like that. And then, of course, there's the economic issue of if the woman is not working and she's dependent financially on the husband, which was oftentimes the case in marriages in the 60s and the 70s, then how much of an opportunity would she really have in order to be independent? But the woman ends up taking the girl's room, and one might say that what the woman is doing now is she's trying to take on the identity of the young girl and spends a lot of time brushing her hair. And there's a lot of ways that we can read that specific detail. Hair brushing is related to self-care. So this now she has the time and the energy and the opportunity to take care of herself as opposed to taking care of others. Hair brushing can also be very soothing. It oftentimes is very repetitive and can offer comfort, much like rocking can offer comfort. And hair is oftentimes associated with female, and female is oftentimes judged by physical appearance more so than male. And then, last but not least, if we are talking about fairy tales, then the very famous fairy tale of Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair. There are those associations as well. And all of those are supposed to be embedded in this idea that she's hairbrushing. And then she begins trying to write a sonnet. Now, we haven't talked about poetry yet, so this might seem a little bit unclear for you at this particular point. But you may know what a sonnet is. A sonnet is a very stylized poem. It has very strict rules in terms of its length, in terms of its subject matter, in terms of its meter or beat, in terms of its rhyme scheme or its pattern of rhyme. So it's a very structured and in some ways a poem that perhaps, or a kind of poem that perhaps reflects her feelings on her own life, that it's very structured and it offers little opportunity for freedom. So when she's thinking about writing the sonnet, she thinks to herself at one point, well, I don't have to write a sonnet that's a certain length or a certain rhyme scheme. That's what she's considering when she's considering ABBA, which is not ABBA for the 1970s rock group, but she's talking about the pattern of rhyme, which we indicate by using letters of the alphabet. And each letter of the alphabet is supposed to represent a new rhyme. So she's thinking about what it is that she's supposed to be doing in order to follow the rules of a sonnet, and then begins to think about, well, I don't have to follow the rules at all. So at this particular point, since she's isolated herself from her family, since she is not fulfilling the roles of wife and mother that society expects of her, since she is taking time for herself and even contemplating not writing a sonnet, as a reader, what we are thinking is that in one way or another, she's going to find a way to break free from societal expectations. Now, that might not necessarily be a good thing for her husband or child, but it could be a good thing for her personally. We know that at this point, she's so isolated from the family that she's accepting notes under the door. And again, that might seem very unrealistic to you until we start talking about a famous poet that you've probably heard of, Emily Dickinson, who was known for also doing similar things, and that she would communicate with notes to individuals rather than actually have one-on-one conversations with them. So it is possible to do something like that. And I think about modern day parallels where people sitting next to one another are texting one another, and maybe communicating through notes is not necessarily that unusual. It's just a different way of communicating. But obviously, this is supposed to illustrate the distance that is occurring between the wife and the mother and the rest of the family. And then we see the season. Now we're in spring. And as I had indicated earlier, spring is supposed to represent renewal and rebirth. So again, as readers, what we are anticipating is that this woman is going to have some sort of renewal or rebirth and find a way to have independent autonomy. And again, that may not necessarily be a good thing for the others, but it could be a good thing for her. She's suffocated by joyful notes. When the family begins to see that she's beginning to leave her isolation. Suffocating is an important word here. Again, it's very negative in tone, and it often, again, is another way in which an individual can commit suicide. And then on page 42, this is a very important quote. She went to the cupboard and took what was hers. She went to the cupboard and took what was hers. It's not directly stated what she took, but what was hers were those batches of sleeping potion that the husband has been making for her. And basically, when she went to the cupboard and took what was hers, this is the beginning of our finding out of how she commits suicide. She completes many chores after this, fulfilling all kinds of expectations of wife and mother. And while this again could be good for the family, it's not good for her when we think about how she's been sorrowful because of these things. And then, of course, when the family comes to see her, the child, in only a way that a child can say, says, she's tired from doing all our things again on page 43. But think about the importance of that statement, that child, as young as that child is, and how simplistically he might view the world, is able to acknowledge something and to realize something that the husband cannot. That the woman is tired from doing things for them, doing all our things again. Now, the husband, at this point, he's checking her wrist, her chest, her eyes. Basically, he's looking for vital signs to see if she's alive, and she's not. And the child, of course, doesn't realize that the woman is dead, and basically asks if they can eat the turkey for supper. And of course, we see that ultimately the child is concerned about his well-being, as a child should be concerned with his well-being, and about whether or not he is going to be able to benefit from the tasks of the woman. So in that respect, he doesn't have the understanding and the acknowledgement, nor should he as a young boy, of why the sorrowful woman was sorrowful. But it's only the boy who's able to acknowledge she's tired from doing all our things again. The husband never gets to that point. And he should have, though again, in the husband's defense, he probably is doing as best as he can with the knowledge that he has and the society in which he lives in. Now, one of the things that I had suggested is that you could use the questions at the ending of the story as a kind of guide, either before you begin reading to help you anticipate some of the things that might be important, or perhaps after you're reading to help you think about how this story could be analyzed, or some combination of the two. And I just wanted to go through some of these questions at the back of page 43. And one of the things that they ask you about is, how are the woman's problems in a sorrowful woman more complex than in a secret sorrow? And I had indicated that in a secret sorrow, the problem can be a very complex one, the idea of fertility. However, it's resolved in just a few paragraphs, and that's much too simplistic. And if nothing else, that's basically the whole point of comparing and contrasting these two pieces, in that a secret sorrow, we could skip multiple chapters and immediately delve into the story and have it make perfect sense. With a sorrowful woman, right from the very first line, there was a wife and mother one too many times, we're left with questions. And that said, one of the things that I had assigned for today on page 1663 was about reading and the writing process, because right now we're in the very beginnings of learning how to read. Eventually we'll transfer over to writing about pieces of literature. And in your previous English class, I'm sure that you did writing. Perhaps you wrote essays about yourself, or you also wrote essays about, let's say, societal issues at large. The focus of this particular semester is that you will be writing essays about a piece of literature. But the literature, of course, is going to be representational of many of the societal issues that were important during the time in which the piece was written and during which the piece was set. And since we aren't given any information about the date in which this piece was set, we assume that the piece was set in the time in which it was written, which would be in the early 1970s, which is why it's suggested that knowing a little bit about the 1970s, particularly in relation to female in the United States, would be very useful to us understanding this particular story. So in terms of reading and the writing process, this might be a section that perhaps you may want to dog ear. And this is one of those sections that is not included online, unfortunately. The pieces of literature that we've been reading, I've been able to find links to. But much of the textbook information about how to read and how to write, that's a proprietary, and that belongs to the editor. And that's why that isn't online at this point. But they do give you suggestions about writing about literature, and that annotating or writing notes in the text is a wonderful way to go about highlighting important ideas or questions as you are reading. I know sometimes students are hesitant to do that because they want to sell back their books. As long as you don't overly highlight or annotate, you should be able to sell back your book. It's one of the reasons why I do prefer paper copies to things rather than electronic copies, because it's not as perhaps easy to annotate electronically as it is on paper, though it is possible to do such a thing. And in fact, we are going to see an example of annotation when we start talking more about the story of an hour in depth. And in fact, one of the things they talk about is that if you don't want to write in the text itself, you might want to write these thoughts on separate sheets of paper or type them on a computer screen. And they talk about this kind of note-taking as journal writing, which is very much related to what I'm thinking of in terms of our journals. If you'll remember, you will have informal writing assignments called journals at the ending of each of the units that we are studying. First unit being short story, second unit being drama, third unit being poetry. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to choose 3 representational samples of each unit. So for short story, I'm asking you to choose 3 short stories and to write approximately a page or so in response to each of those short stories. Your thoughts, your ideas, your questions, things perhaps we've talked about in the discussion forum, or things perhaps that I've raised on the video. So there are lots of different ways that you can go about this. And I just wanted to read to you the way the textbook talks about journal writing. That another way to record your impressions of a work is to keep a journal. By writing down your reactions to characters, images, language, actions, and other matters in a reading journal, you can often determine why you like or dislike a work, or feel sympathetic or antagonistic to an author, or discover paths into a work that might have eluded you if you hadn't preserved your impressions. Your journal notes and annotations may take whatever form you find useful. Full sentences and grammatical correctness are not essential unless they are to be handed into an instructor that requires that. And keep in mind that I do not. Though, if they were written in sentences, they might allow you to make better sense of your own reflections days later. But the point is simply to put in writing the thoughts that you can retrieve, when you need them for class discussion or for a writing assignment. And they even give you an example of that on page 1666, where someone has highlighted important things by circling and underlining and so forth. And this can also be very useful in terms of writing a paper, because after you've submitted in a journal for your short stories and I've evaluated it and I've returned it back to you, then ultimately all of you will be writing a paper about short story. And I will be giving you some suggested paper topics over the next few classes. But you can certainly come up with your own, and as long as you have it approved by me, you can pursue that. And your journals can be of assistance with this, because you might want to try out an idea for a paper in a journal, or a journal might spur an idea that you can examine further. That's it. The journals don't necessarily have to be in any way connected to the paper, but in thinking about how to put all of the assignments together, the journals can be very useful to help you with something like that. Papers are much more formal. The average paper for this class would be approximately 4 to 5 pages long, and it would be about one particular story or one particular element within a couple of stories. and it would be a much more in-depth analysis. And starting on page 1667, it begins to talk about the process of writing a paper. And that's the area that you might want to highlight. Not that you are writing a paper yet, and we will also be reviewing the concept of writing a paper as the semester progresses. But basically what you have to do is you need to choose some sort of a topic, and then once you've got some sort of a topic, you need to turn it into a thesis, some sort of a specific perspective that you're taking about the work that reasonable people could disagree with, something that can be debated. And then your job is basically to prove that thesis as at least possible. It doesn't necessarily have to be probable, just possible, based on the evidence in the text, the references within the text, both a mix of quotation, specific language that you're using from the text, and paraphrase, which is when you're putting in your own words part of what's going on in the particular text. So for instance, if you were going to write a paper, let's say about a sorrowful woman, and talk a little bit about how the sorrowful woman feels, as I was suggesting earlier, she feels trapped by her roles as wife and mother, then what you would need to do is to provide evidence from the text to illustrate places where she feels trapped. So the question isn't whether or not she's sorrowful. That's a fact. She is sorrowful. Why she is sorrowful, that's something that can be debated. That's something that reasonable people can disagree about. But there's certainly enough pieces of evidence in the text, as I've suggested, to read this text as a text about gender and the role of female in this time period of wife and mother. Now, in terms of papers, on page 1678, they actually give you some suggestions of how to go about writing a paper, revising and editing, and with a whole bunch of questions that we will be revisiting as well. And part of these questions is the topic manageable. You don't want a topic that's too narrow or broad. Is there a clear thesis? Is the paper logically organized? Is your argument persuasive? And many of these were the questions that you would have asked yourself in English 101 when you were writing about either yourself or societal issues. Should any material be deleted because it just is not relevant to your thesis? Do you have an opening paragraph that introduces the topic? And for a piece of literature, our opening paragraph would have the name of the text and the name of the author so that it would be very clear to the reader. Are your paragraphs developed and unified and coherent? Are there transitions linking your paragraphs? Do you have a concluding paragraph that gives a sense of closure? Is the tone appropriate? Is it formal enough and academic enough? Do you have a title? And that title should be engaging and suggestive. It shouldn't be the specific title of the work itself. Are your sentences clear and concise and complete? Are you using technical terms, literary terms correctly? Are you quoting and making sure that you're not quoting too much just so that you can fill up space on the paper, but not too little either, because the quotes will help to serve as evidence? Have you followed your instructor's guidelines for writing a paper? And have you carefully proofread your final draft before you hand it in? And again, we will be discussing all of these things in greater depth as the semester goes on, but I just wanted you to be aware of these questions on page 1678 and keep them in the back of your mind, especially as you begin thinking about what you might want to write a paper about. And in terms of the journals on short story won't be due until the 18th of February, because by that point we will have finished our short story section. But there's no reason why you have to wait until the 18th of February to hand in your journals. Once you've identified the 3 short stories that you wish to write about, you can write about them. So as we continue to talk about short stories, it could end up that some of the earlier short stories or short stories that you are more interested in pursuing for a journal, and you can write on those and hand in your journal early and hence get feedback early. But I wanted to have the due date be at the very ending of the unit so that all of the short stories would have been read and studied by us as a class by that point, so that you would have the whole in front of you from which to pick and choose. So the other piece that I had assigned for today was a short story entitled The Story of an Hour. And this piece was included in the earlier set of readings that we did at the beginning of the semester. And I wanted us to revisit this not as an example of how to go reading, but actually analyze it and interpret it and critique it. And this story is very short. It's only about a page and a half long or so. It's on page 15 to 16 of the text in which I had assigned. And on page 17, they give you an example of how you could go about annotating it. In other words, writing notes in the margins about things that strike you that could be important. Or another way of thinking about this, their examples of the annotations could be things that you could write in a journal if you were going to write about this particular story. Now, of course, they haven't talked about everything in the story, so chances are that there are many other things that you could examine and pursue. And that's what we're going to be talking about next class. Is I wanted to read the story of an hour in more depth, much like we did with The Sorrowful Woman, and talk a little bit about that piece and its similarities and differences to A Sorrowful Woman. So we'll do that next class, a story of an hour. You can see that I've included a link for that online if it turns out that you don't have the text, as well as a short story entitled A Rose for Emily, which is a piece written by William Faulkner. And if you know anything at all about William Faulkner, he's considered one of those literary greats in the literary canon, those works that are considered by scholars and critics worthy of study. And I also have a link for this piece if it turns out that you don't have access to the textbook. And one of the reasons why I chose this particular short story is because it includes an interview with the author about his writing of that particular work. So I thought it would be interesting for us to see and read his thoughts and reflections about the creation of his own piece. So that's where we're headed for next class. In terms of today's attendance question, I thought it could relate to the story of an hour. The story of an hour presents us with characters who have names, which is very difficult or very different from what we saw with Sorrowful Woman. And I would suggest that the name Mallard, the surname, is particularly important in this particular piece, especially because the piece is so short. It's only a page and a half long, so every detail counts. The shorter it is, the more likely it is that every single element has a certain level of significance, which is why I've oftentimes argued that perhaps it's harder to write a short story than it is a novel, because with a short story, you don't have the luxury of perhaps losing focus for a chapter or two. I mean, every single word has to be precise and important for the telling of the tale itself. But this idea of mallards, now you might know quite a bit about mallards at this point, or you might know absolutely nothing about mallards. Mallard is a duck, by the way. You may or may not have known that. And what I am going to ask you to do is a little bit of research. See what you can find out about mallards. And the attendance question is, identify a quality associated with mallards that could apply to Mrs. Mallard and the story of an hour, and illustrate how that is. In other words, try to determine why it is that the author might have chosen Mallard as a surname as opposed to any other bird or any other surname that existed on the face of the planet. So are there qualities associated with mallards that could be related to Mrs. Mallard and the story of an hour? So I know that when I ask students to do research, their first go-to response is, I'm going on Google and I'm going on Wikipedia. I'm not necessarily averse to that, but know that there are better ways to do research. We do have a GCC library with a whole host of databases that allow you to do research, and the advantage of that is that all of that information has been reviewed and tested for a certain level of accuracy in the way that it is not reviewed and tested for accuracy on other websites, such as Google, whatever you could find there. So, but again, I'm not necessarily going to tell you where to do your research. Just see what you can find out about mallards and see if you can make any connections between a mallard and the story itself. So I look forward to reading your discussion forum responses. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about the story of an hour and a rose for Emily. Take care. Bye bye.